"Scott, your mother is like mold in the bathroom," Brittany said, sipping her wine without looking at me. "You don't notice it at first, but one day you wake up and realize it's spreading, stinking, and impossible to live with. You either clean it out or you move." I felt my soul detach for a moment. Even the waiter flinched. My son didn't say a word. That night, I stopped being a mother in their eyes. But if I was mold, then I'd rot everything they built, quietly, thoroughly, permanently. Let me tell you who I am, or rather, who I used to be. My name is Mabel Peterson, 72 years old. I live in Lafayette, Louisiana, in the same quiet house George and I bought when we were still young and foolish enough to think life would be fair. I was once a respected school administrator, organized, firm, and calm under pressure. I knew how to run a school and a home. I once had the admiration of staff and students, the respect of neighbors, and the love of my husband. That was another lifetime. Now I have a dog named Buddy, 2 worn-out recliners, and a son who thinks I'm decaying wallpaper in the background of his real life. George died of a stroke 7 years ago. He was my balance, my laughter, my reason to keep fighting. When he left, everything crumbled slowly. Scott and Brittany asked me to move closer, said they wanted me nearby, that it would be easier on everyone. And at the time, I believed them. I believed they wanted me. Not just my presence, but my heart, my wisdom, my stories. But tonight showed me exactly where I stand. They had picked the grandeur, an upscale restaurant in town, gold-rimmed plates, tiny portions, linen napkins that cost more than my weekly groceries. Brittany arrived in a glittering dress and heels that clicked like gunfire across the marble floor. She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a comment about how I looked tired but cute. I tried to shake off the unease. I wanted to celebrate Scott's promotion. I wanted to belong, even for one evening. But the discomfort only grew. First, Brittany corrected the waiter when I asked what burrata was, saying, "Don't worry, she's not used to this kind of menu." Then she laughed when I mispronounced the wine name. Scott chuckled along. I laughed too, out of habit, out of shame. But nothing prepared me for what she said halfway through dinner. That sentence, that metaphor, that insult masked as observation. "Your mother is like mold." My body froze, but my thoughts screamed. She wasn't just calling me old. She was calling me rot. She was saying I didn't just exist. I infected. I spread. I ruined. And my son, my Scott, the boy I once rocked to sleep during hurricane warnings, didn't flinch, didn't defend, didn't even blink. He kept cutting his steak, calm and complicit. I pushed my plate back and stood up quietly, said I had a headache. They nodded, barely pausing. No one offered to walk me to the car. No one asked if I was all right. The air outside was thick and humid, typical for a Louisiana summer night. The sky was black velvet, smeared with stars, and the parking lot buzzed with insects and fluorescent light. Buddy wagged his tail as I opened the car door. He always waits, always believes. I sat in the driver's seat, shaking, then reached into my bag and unwrapped a sandwich I'd packed earlier. Turkey and Swiss, slightly warm now, the bread limp. I took a bite, staring out at the glowing restaurant. Inside those walls, laughter flowed. Champagne popped. My absence wasn't noticed, or worse, maybe it was welcomed. I chewed slowly, the sandwich dry against my tongue, and the shame rose like bile. I felt it in my throat, behind my eyes, in the hollow beneath my ribs. How did I get here? How did the woman who once negotiated union contracts, led staff meetings, and raised a kind little boy become this invisible, discarded, moldy thing? I sat in silence, letting the truth settle like dust. This wasn't an accident. This was erosion. Slow, constant, deliberate, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to reverse the decay. If they saw me as mold, then perhaps it was time they learned what rot can do when it's had enough. I barely remember driving home. The streets of Lafayette blurred past in streaks of gold and red as Buddy snoozed beside me, unaware of the storm swirling inside me. The radio played some old country tune George would have hummed along to, but it sounded distant, like it was being played in a house I no longer lived in. When I pulled into the driveway, everything felt too quiet. Even the wind had forgotten my name. I left the sandwich wrapper in the car and walked inside, not bothering to turn on the lights. The house smelled like lavender and dust. My shoes echoed on the wooden floors, one of the few remaining things George and I had picked out together. I used to love this house. Now it felt like a waiting room for the forgotten. I dropped my purse on the table and collapsed into the armchair. Buddy curled up at my feet. I stared at the blank television screen for what must have been an hour. Not thinking, not feeling, just sitting. Then the questions came. How did it come to this? How did I become the woman people speak over at dinner? How did I go from the person people turn to for advice, for support, for leadership, to someone whose presence feels like an inconvenience? I had spent my entire adult life giving, to George, to Scott, to the school. I worked full-time while Scott was young, balanced payrolls with science fair projects, PTA meetings with sleepless nights. I cooked, cleaned, earned, and stretched every dollar when George was laid off for 2 years. And when he passed, I didn't collapse. I stayed strong, for Scott, for the future, for family. And now I'm something Brittany compares to mold. I felt the tears building, sharp and acidic. But I didn't cry, not yet. There was something colder than sorrow rising inside me, shame. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I stayed too quiet for too long. Maybe I said yes too often. Maybe I gave so much that I taught them I didn't need anything back. Maybe I trained them to believe I didn't matter. That thought hit harder than Brittany's words. Because what if the real betrayal didn't come from them? What if it started with me? I replayed every moment from the dinner, every second Scott stayed silent, every time he looked down instead of speaking up. That wasn't the boy I raised, but maybe I hadn't raised him to protect me. Maybe I had raised him to believe I'd always endure, no matter what. George would have never let that happen. He would have said something, put Brittany in her place, firmly but respectfully. He always had a way of drawing lines without raising his voice. I missed him more in that moment than I had in years. The way he used to stroke the back of my hand under the table. The way he'd pour my tea first. The way he'd say, "Mabel, no one puts you in the corner, not even me." God, I missed being seen. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, switching on the dim light. The dishes from breakfast were still in the sink. A glass sat by the kettle, half full of water I'd forgotten to drink that morning. I felt the loneliness wrap around me like a fog. Not loud, not sharp, just heavy. I poured myself a cup of tea, but didn't drink it. I just stood there, watching the steam rise and disappear into nothing. In the hallway, I passed the photo wall. George in his uniform, Scott at his high school graduation, the 3 of us at a summer barbecue, smiling, laughing, me holding a plate of ribs like it was a trophy. I touched the frame. Was that woman still inside me? Could I find her again? Later that night, in bed, I finally let myself cry. Not for them, but for me. For the years I gave, for the dignity I'd slowly let slip, For the silence I mistook for peace. Buddy nudged my hand, then curled into the crook of my legs. He didn't say much, but he never left. That meant something. And as I stared at the ceiling, a single thought lingered. If I was the one who taught them how to treat me, then maybe I could also teach them what happens when I stop playing that role. The next morning came, gray and thick with silence. I woke up earlier than usual, the way older people do, without alarms, without dreams, just the dull ache of consciousness. My pillow was damp from last night's tears, and my body carried that familiar heaviness that had become a second skin. Grief was like laundry that never dried. It clung to everything. Buddy stood by the bed, tail wagging, eyes hopeful. I gave him a soft pat and whispered, "Let's survive another day, huh?" As I brewed my morning coffee, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman staring back at me looked faded, not broken, but frayed around the edges. I hadn't really looked at myself in years, not past the surface anyway. But this time I studied the lines on my face like they were sentences from a book I'd forgotten I'd written. Behind every wrinkle was a story. The laugh lines from George's jokes, the worry creases from Scott's teenage years, the slight sag around my jaw from all the times I stayed quiet when I should have screamed. I used to believe that my aging was proof of a life well lived. Now I wasn't sure it was living. Maybe it was just lasting. After breakfast, I pulled down a box from the hallway closet. Inside were photo albums, the old kind, the ones with sticky pages and faded captions. I hadn't opened it in years. The first picture was from my wedding day, George in his navy suit. Me in a tea-length dress I made myself with fabric bought on sale. He used to say I looked like a movie star. I used to believe him. I flipped through pages, Scott as a baby, round cheeks, blue eyes, Scott at 5, hugging my leg in the school parking lot. Scott at 17, standing stiff in his graduation robe, forcing a smile. Each photo felt like a betrayal now. Because how do you go from that, a boy who clung to your hand, to a man who lets his wife call you mold in a public restaurant? Maybe I had failed him. Maybe I hadn't raised him to respect me, only to rely on me. I gave him my time, my energy, my youth. But maybe I forgot to teach him boundaries, accountability. Maybe I had mistaken love for sacrifice, and in doing so, taught him that love meant I had no needs of my own. That realization punched the air from my lungs. I closed the album and stood up too quickly. My knees cracked in protest. I leaned against the hallway wall and let my breath return. Then I noticed something I hadn't in years. A frame on the wall had tilted, just a little. George and I always kept our frames straight. He used to tease me for adjusting them weekly. "It's your secret obsession," he'd say. "Straight pictures, straight life." I reached out and fixed it. One small thing, one tiny correction in a life full of slant. It made me pause. Maybe I couldn't go back and raise Scott differently. Maybe I couldn't undo the nights I stayed silent, the times I paid for things I shouldn't have, or the birthdays they forgot. But maybe I could straighten a few things now. Later that afternoon, I took Buddy for a walk past the neighborhood lake. A little girl waved at us. Her grandmother walked beside her. They laughed at something, the child pointing at ducks. The older woman knelt down, kissed the top of the girl's head, and whispered something into her ear. I felt tears burn behind my eyes, not out of envy, but out of memory. That used to be me. That used to be my hand Scott held. A warmth spread through my chest. Not pain, not regret, but something else. Resolve, because I wasn't dead yet. And if I still had breath in my lungs and fire in my bones, then maybe, just maybe, I could do more than survive their neglect. Maybe I could rewrite the ending. That night, I pulled out my old journal from the nightstand drawer. I hadn't written in it since George passed. The leather was cracked. The pages smelled of time. I opened to a fresh page and wrote one line. I am not invisible. And for the first time in years, I believed it. It started with the sandwich, not the insult, not Brittany's voice, not even Scott's silence. It was that limp, lukewarm turkey sandwich I ate alone in the parking lot, with Buddy curled beside me under the fluorescent lights of the grandeur. That sandwich wasn't just a meal, it was a metaphor for who I had become in their lives. I wasn't invited in, I wasn't celebrated, I wasn't seen, I was tolerated, I was useful, I was background. That sandwich, eaten alone in a car I paid for, outside a restaurant I paid for, while my son and his wife toasted themselves on my dime, it changed me. It became a symbol of how little they thought of me, of how easily I'd let myself disappear, of how I had allowed them to mistake my love for weakness. Every time I passed that intersection after that night, I remembered. And with each memory, something inside me hardened. It wasn't rage that grew inside me, it was clarity, cold, sharp, steady. A few days later, while organizing the hallway drawers, I found an envelope marked Urgent Final Notice. I nearly tossed it, thinking it was junk mail, but paused when I noticed the return address. It was from a mortgage lender, addressed to Scott and Brittany. I blinked. Why would it come to my house? Curious, I opened it. Inside was a past due mortgage statement, 2 months late, with penalties. There were notes in red ink about potential foreclosure and a printed warning, last chance to avoid default. I stood in the hallway, heart pounding, not from fear, but from realization. They were drowning. The perfect house Brittany bragged about. The open concept kitchen, the granite countertops, the shiny white SUV in the driveway, all of it held together by unpaid bills and hollow pride. And suddenly I saw it. Not revenge, not retribution, but opportunity. For once, I wouldn't be the one begging to be seen. They would. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out a notepad. My hands trembled, not with emotion, but with purpose. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was planning. The next morning, I made 2 calls. The first was to Ms. Elise Davies, one of my former students, now a real estate attorney in Baton Rouge. She had written me a thank you card 5 years ago, saying I was the only adult who ever believed in her. She answered on the first ring. Mrs. Peterson, anything you need, I'm here. The second was to my bank. I asked about purchasing debt portfolios. Specifically, I wanted to inquire about acquiring one particular mortgage note, quietly, legally. By the end of the week, I had the wheels in motion. Over the next 6 weeks, I played the role they expected me to play. When Brittany called with her sugary tone, "Mabel, we might need a small favor. Just something to get us through the month," I feigned concern. "Oh dear," I said. "You know things are a little tight right now, but let me see what I can do." When Scott hinted at needing help, "It's just a rough patch, Mom. You know how it is." I nodded sympathetically and offered him leftover casserole. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that I had already bought their debt. That I was now the legal holder of their mortgage. They owed me. It was all done through Ms. Davies. Perfectly clean, perfectly quiet. They had no idea that the woman they pitied at dinner, the woman they mocked as fragile and fading, now had the power to pull the rug out from under their feet. And I wasn't going to scream or slam any doors. That would give them too much dignity. I would do this slowly, strategically, coldly. Because what Brittany and Scott feared most wasn't confrontation, it was consequence. And I was no longer afraid to be the one delivering it. Every night, I'd sit by the window with my tea and watch the porch light flicker across the street. I imagined Brittany pouring another glass of wine, still smug in her illusion. I imagined Scott checking his phone, avoiding the bank's calls, thinking it would all somehow fix itself. They had no idea the reckoning was coming, not with fire, but with silence and a signature. It happened just as I knew it would. By the middle of August, Scott and Brittany were out of options. The bank had stopped negotiating, late fees were stacking like bricks, their credit cards were maxed out, and even Brittany's parents had stopped returning their calls. The perfectly curated life they posted online, the dinners, the outfits, the sparkling smiles, was starting to crack at the corners. So finally, inevitably, they came to me. They showed up one Sunday afternoon with forced smiles and a store-bought pie. Brittany wore a pastel dress, her voice dripping syrup. Scott looked pale, thin, tired. I could smell the desperation before either of them said a word. "We've been thinking, Mom," Scott began, shifting uncomfortably. "It might be time we stopped pretending everything's fine." "That's very brave," I said, keeping my tone flat. Brittany took over quickly. We've hit a few bumps with the house. You know how unpredictable the economy is. The interest rates, inflation, it's all so unfair." Unfair. She had the nerve to call it unfair. I kept nodding politely, waiting for the pitch. Finally, they got to the point. "What we were thinking," Scott said, avoiding eye contact, "is that maybe you could help us, temporarily. Just a small loan. A short-term fix. It wouldn't be forever, just enough to help us stay afloat." I looked at them, hands folded neatly in my lap, and asked, "How much do you need?" Brittany brightened. "Just around $25,000 to catch up on a few payments, maybe a little extra for breathing room." $25,000 after everything, after calling me mold, after leaving me to eat cold sandwiches in my car outside a restaurant I paid for. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I stood and walked to the side table, pulling out a folder I had prepared days ago. "I've actually been working with my financial advisor recently," I said casually. "Just going over some documents, preparing my estate, you know, making sure everything's in order." I placed the folder on the table and gently slid it toward them. Inside was the new mortgage agreement, my mortgage agreement, with their names on it. Scott frowned and opened it. "What's this?" "It's your loan," I said calmly. "Technically, it's a new refinance agreement. I've already covered your outstanding debt. You now owe me directly." Brittany's smile vanished. "Wait, what?" "I bought your mortgage," I said simply. "Weeks ago, through a legal intermediary. Everything was filed properly. You've been paying me, not the bank." Scott stared, stunned. "You're joking." "Does that sound like a joke?" I asked, tilting my head. Brittany flipped through the document, her hands trembling. "What is this interest rate?" she snapped. "This is outrageous. There are penalties, balloon clauses. This isn't standard." "You signed it," I replied. "Both of you. You didn't read the fine print. You were so eager to get bailed out. You assumed the terms would be generous." Scott's voice was tight. "You tricked us." "No," I said. "You underestimated me. There's a difference." I stood, slowly and deliberately. My voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. "You thought I was a soft target. An old woman with no spine and too much guilt. You thought I would pay quietly, like I always did. And maybe I would have, if you hadn't decided to humiliate me, if you hadn't made it so clear that I was nothing but a wallet in your eyes." Silence filled the room like fog. Brittany's face twisted. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I smiled gently. "No, I'm just not apologizing for it." Scott looked away. He couldn't meet my eyes. "You have 60 days, I said firmly. "Pay the balance or lose the house. No extensions, no favors. I suggest you start downsizing." Brittany opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand. "I won't be manipulated anymore," I said. "Not by either of you." I walked to the door and opened it. They stood, hesitated. I didn't speak again. They left. That night, I sat on the porch with Buddy curled beside me, my hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea. The stars blinked gently over Lafayette. The air was still, and for the first time in years, so was my heart. I didn't feel guilty. I felt whole. They had underestimated me. But now they knew. I wasn't weak, I was patient, and I had just reminded them who raised the roof they slept under. The first payment was late, just 6 days, enough to trigger the clause. I didn't say a word. I simply sent a formal letter through Ms. Davies, outlining the penalties. Interest would increase by 1.5%, and an additional $1,200 would be added to the next month's bill. 2 days later, Scott called. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "Mom, this is excessive. You know we're trying." I replied, "Trying isn't paying." And I hung up. There was no satisfaction in that moment, just stillness, a silence I had earned. Brittany tried next. She texted, as I knew she would. "This is cruel, Mabel. We're family." Then another. "You can't possibly need the money. You own your house. You have no expenses." And finally, "What kind of mother does this?" I didn't respond. Not to her, not to any of it. Because I had already done enough explaining for a lifetime. They had explanations. I had documentation. They had excuses. I had signatures. I was no longer debating with them. I was enforcing a boundary. The second payment was missed entirely. This time I sent a breach notice. They had 30 days to cure the default, or the full balance, nearly $200,000, would become due immediately. No extensions, no exceptions. I imagined the panic behind their front door, Brittany storming through rooms, making angry calls, Scott pacing in the garage, his voice low and shaking. The fantasy of control slipping through their hands. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt centered. Because this wasn't about winning, it was about reclaiming. For years, I'd been the wallpaper in the background of their lives, present, familiar, invisible. Now I was the foundation they never thought to check, and they were standing on a fault line. One afternoon, I saw Brittany at the grocery store. She didn't notice me at first, her cart nearly empty, her phone in hand, sunglasses on despite the fluorescent lighting. She looked thinner. The designer handbags were gone. She wore faded jeans and flat shoes. Her hair wasn't done. The image was cracking. We locked eyes. She froze. Then, surprisingly, she walked toward me. "Please," she said quietly, her voice shaking, "don't take the house." I looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" She swallowed. "Because it's our home. Because Scott's struggling. Because we didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't mean to humiliate me?" I asked calmly. "You didn't mean to treat me like a burden?" She looked away. "We panicked. We thought we were smarter than we were. I was scared." "That's not fear," I said. "That's arrogance." She blinked, lips tightening. "I'm not taking your house," I continued. "I'm offering a choice. Pay what you owe or sell. Either way, your outcome is in your hands. That's more grace than you gave me when you left me outside like an animal." She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away, pushing her cart like it weighed 1,000 pounds. By the end of the month, they defaulted again. That triggered the balloon clause. They now had 90 days to pay the full balance, or face foreclosure. I didn't gloat. I didn't sip wine with a smirk. I just paid the electric bill, took Buddy for his walk, and made tea. Life continued, only now I was in charge of mine. They thought I would cave when they cried. They thought guilt would soften me, but I had no guilt left to give. One evening, Scott came by alone. He didn't bring pie. He didn't wear a tie. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 months. His eyes were hollow. His hands trembled slightly. He stood on my porch for a while before knocking. I let him wait. When I finally opened the door, he said just one thing. "I didn't realize how badly we treated you." I looked at him. I didn't speak. He lowered his eyes. "I miss Dad. I think he'd be ashamed of me." That stung more than I expected, but I didn't let it show. "He'd want you to grow up," I said, "to take responsibility, to stop using love as a leash." He nodded. "I've picked up work again. Deliveries, night shifts. Brittany's selling the car. We're trying." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He stepped back. "Thanks for answering the door." And then he walked away, heavy steps echoing down the porch stairs. That night, I sat in the backyard under the pecan tree George planted 20 years ago. Buddy snored softly beside me, and the wind whispered through the branches above. The stars blinked over Lafayette, warm and silent. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I saw myself, and for once that was enough. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse. At first, it came in whispers. Brittany sold her designer handbags online. Scott traded his leased SUV for a used sedan with chipped paint and a missing hubcap. Their weekly dinner photos stopped showing up on social media. Their smiles faded, their filters vanished. Then came the garage sale. I didn't go, of course, but neighbors mentioned it. They looked different, Mrs. Kellerman across the street told me, like people waking up after a long bad dream. They sold patio furniture, a treadmill still wrapped in plastic, and framed inspirational quotes Brittany used to hang above the fireplace. Family is everything. The irony didn't escape me. But even with the sales, the debt remained. And still, they didn't pay. The deadline loomed like a thundercloud. 90 days. That was the deal. I had circled it on the calendar, red, bold, unmoving. Some nights I would wake and glance at it, heart beating calmly, not with fear, with certainty. Scott came by again, just him this time. No pie, no apologies rehearsed. He wore a faded shirt. His eyes were hollow, the sparkle gone. He looked like a man carrying every poor decision he'd ever made on his back. "I wanted to say thanks," he said softly, standing on the porch, "for forcing us to face the truth." I didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and handed me a folded receipt. "We made a payment. It's not much, but it's something. We're trying." It was barely 2% of what they owed. Still, I took it, nodded, and said, "Thank you." That was all. He lingered. "Brittany's different now. She doesn't yell so much. We cook at home. I think we're realizing what matters." I nodded once more. Then I closed the door. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't wrestle with myself. Late at night, when the lights were off and Buddy snored beside me, I'd lie there and wonder, am I becoming like them? Cold, unforgiving, hard? I looked at George's photo one evening, voice barely above a whisper. "Would you be proud of me or disappointed?" In the stillness, the answer came, not in words, but in feeling. You're finally standing up for yourself. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. I started reclaiming more than power. I reclaimed space. The guest room, Scott's old room, had become a storage closet of memories. I cleared it out, packed away old trophies, yearbooks, outdated clothes. I kept the photos, but I moved them. On the walls, I hung paintings George and I had collected in New Mexico. Sunsets, deserts, empty mesas that somehow felt full of life. I changed the curtains, repainted the trim. For once, I wasn't preserving a shrine to someone else's childhood. I was building something for myself. The house didn't feel like a waiting room anymore. It felt like a home, my home. On the 87th day, Brittany called. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Her voice was thin, flat, like a balloon long out of air. "We're selling the house," she said. "There's no point in pretending anymore. The agent thinks we'll break even. The rest will go to you. I hope that's acceptable." "It is," I replied. Pause. "You really weren't bluffing, were you?" "No," I said. "I was just done being erased." Another pause. Then, "Goodbye, Mabel." The sale closed within the week. They moved into a condo on the other side of town. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, no patio, no granite countertops, no room for pride. Scott didn't call again. Brittany sent one last text. "I hope you're happy." I stared at it for a long time, then deleted it, because I wasn't happy, but I was whole. A few days later, I walked out to the garden. The roses George had planted were blooming, thick and red. The air smelled of earth and quiet. Buddy sniffed along the path, tail wagging slowly. I pruned back the wild stems, wore gloves, but the thorns still caught me. A sting, but not pain. Pain was being ignored. Pain was being humiliated. This was control. This was peace. I breathed in deep, because after all this time, I finally understood. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's self-erasure, and I would never ever erase myself again. The day the check arrived, I didn't rush to open it. It sat on the kitchen table for hours, nestled between the salt shaker and the grocery list. I knew exactly what it was. The final payment from the sale of Scott and Brittany's house. The last thread tying me to the chaos, the pleading, the pain. When I finally opened the envelope, I didn't feel triumph, just closure. I folded the check gently, walked to the drawer where I kept my bills, and slid it inside. No fanfare, no champagne, no smug smile, just peace. In the days that followed, life slowed down. The kind of slow that feels like healing. I planted tomatoes in the garden behind the porch, repainted the old white fence, reorganized the pantry, took Buddy out on longer walks around the neighborhood. I said hello to the postman instead of hiding behind the curtains. I hummed while sweeping the kitchen. I even baked a peach cobbler just for me. It wasn't happiness exactly, it was wholeness. One morning I awoke and realized something was missing, not an object, but a weight. The heaviness in my chest I had carried for years was gone. Grief didn't leave, not fully. It simply settled into the background, like the gentle hum of an old refrigerator. I could hear it, feel it, but it no longer ruled me. I never heard from Scott again. No calls, no letters, not even a text on my birthday. And that hurt, not in the screaming, fiery way, but in the quiet ache of a scar. Still, I no longer needed his voice to validate mine. I no longer needed to be anyone's mother, to be someone worth loving. I was enough, not in spite of being forgotten, but because I remembered myself. A few weeks later, I hosted a small gathering in my backyard. Just 5 women from the community garden. Women like me, widows, caretakers, survivors of silence. We brought lemonade, deviled eggs, banana bread, and folding chairs. We laughed about gray hairs and bad knees. We shared stories about lost love, forgotten dreams, and second chances. At one point, Carla, the newest among us, looked around and said, "This place feels steady, like it's been rebuilt from something broken." I smiled and replied, "That's because it has." That evening, as the sky burned orange over Louisiana, I sat on the porch with Buddy at my feet. The roses George had planted years ago swayed gently in the breeze. The wind chimes above me sang a soft lullaby. Everything around me breathed peace. Not perfection, not fairy tale, but peace, earned, hard-won, and mine. Before going to bed, I pulled out my old journal, the one I had ignored for over a year. I opened a fresh page and wrote, "I am not what they called me. I am not forgotten. I am not an object to be shelved. I am the ground beneath my own feet. I am the roof over my own head. I am the voice that refused to stay quiet." Then I closed the journal and set it beside my bed. Sometimes I still think of Scott, not in anger, not in bitterness, just as a fact, a person I once knew in a certain way. I wonder if he ever regrets the things he didn't say, if he remembers that night when his wife called me storage, if he realizes that silence can be as violent as words. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. That's no longer mine to carry, because here's what I've learned. Forgiveness doesn't mean returning. Letting go doesn't mean letting them back in. And silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it's a boundary, a shield, a choice. Now when I walk through my home, I don't hear echoes of betrayal. I hear the hum of my own breath. I hear Buddy's pause on the tile. I hear the clink of my teacup, the turning of a page, the rustle of wind through lace curtains. And in those sounds, I find something sacred, my life, not the life they tried to script for me, not the one I was guilted into living, but mine, fully, quietly, proudly. Have you ever felt like Mabel, silenced, overlooked, or treated like you didn't matter? If this story touched something deep in your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and share your thoughts, your strength, or your story. And if you believe it's never too late to choose yourself, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories that honor your voice. Because your story matters, you matter. And sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths.